All right, this afternoon I'm down in San Diego's Old Town to introduce one of the features of the California Historical Landmarks Project. As you know, one piece of the project is to visit your historical landmark and to interpret it as a historical site on top of the interpretation that was given it by the Historical Landmarks Board at the time when it was landmarked. And so today I've chosen my specific historical landmark down here in Old Town, which is the Whaley House. Supposedly America's most haunted house. So let's take a look at some of the features that I see when I'm looking at a landscape like this. When you get to your California historical landmark, take a look and see if you can find the landmarking plaque that was placed on the building at the time it was landmarked. The Whaley House, we can find the brass plaque here on the front wall. You should take notes, you should read it carefully to make sure that it's the same wordage that you would find in the website of the California Historic Landmarks Program. I read this one and realized that the text here had been changed. And so that's a very interesting feature. And we might ask the question, what has changed in the interpretation from the original 1932 Statement of Significance? When did it happen and what difference does it make? So I encourage you to take a look at the landscape surrounding your historical landmark and give it a close and careful look. Walk around a few times and see if there's a ghost tour going on or what else you might find about the type of historical interpretation that's taking place here at the time. You'll see that the Whaley House is one of a complex of historical buildings that's located here in Old Town, and it includes the Verna House, an 1870s mansard-style, roof-style house, as well as the Whaley House itself, some open space in the center, as well as a number of other buildings. We can step off the busy and crowded street into a quiet and contemplative space that perhaps might give us a sense of a quieter time in the past. One of the first things that I'm interested in visiting a historical site is the written signage that the curators have included in the site, and there's plenty to work with here at the Whaley House. So for instance, here the back corner of the house is the San Diego courthouse structure that was part of the Whaley structure, and it includes an interpreted sign here. On this wall we have a sign with a story about an incident that took place here in the 1870s, a decade and a half after the house was built, in a dispute between residents of San Diego's Old Town and the growing New Town, and where the county courthouse should be located. When you visit your California historical landmark, take notes and think about what you may learn from stories such as these and the signage both outside the buildings and in. So you can start by taking a look at some of the written historical features and what they seem to emphasize about the historical importance of this place. And so far in this corner, it certainly looks like the interpreters are leaning into the role of the Whaley House, not as a residence, but as a feature of civic life in San Diego. If your historical landmark is open or includes a museum on the inside like the Whaley House, feel free to go in, take a look at the exhibits and see what they have to say about your landmark and its time and place and the way that it's interpreted today, in contrast with the way that it might be interpreted on the plaque on the outside. Here at the Whaley House, they have a reconstructed county courtroom, much as it might have looked at the time when the Whaley House served as San Diego's first county court. It has historical photographs on the walls with captions, and in the front a reconstructed county court bench with pictures of Presidents George Washington and Ulysses S. Grant on the wall. The fact that Grant served as president after the county court moved from this building might give us an indication that the interpreters of this place were perhaps a little more interested in creating a sense of history than in historical accuracy itself. Further look at the written interpretation around the Whaley House brings us to this Old Town San Diego timeline. And there's some interesting features of this. It includes the construction of the Whaley House down here in the lower left, in the middle of a long history of San Diego, which begins up in the upper left corner, apparently pre-1542. And so here in the upper left, we have the only indication of indigenous Californians' role here in San Diego. It is in a single paragraph. The local people are not named, and we get a sense of very little happening historically prior to the arrival of the first Europeans with Cabrillo's voyage in 1542. Right, here's Cabrillo's voyage. We've got Spanish colonization, the mission system, and then a significant section on Mexican California, the arrival of the Americans, and then efforts here to reconstruct San Diego's old town. So this is a wider history of the Whaley House and its place in San Diego's history, but the significant pieces seem to be missing. One other note that you might pay attention to is who sponsored some of these historical interpretations. Is it the state of California? Is it a private company? Is it the Daughters of the Golden West of California, or a heritage group like this? In this case, it's the Old Town Market San Diego Historic Tours of America. This is a private company that does historical landmarking and then sells tours and also gifts and stuff. And they have a gift shop just down the street here. So this is a history which was produced by a company whose design is to use history to sell tickets. If we continue our investigation of the site for written text around the site, we come across this lurid tale of the hanging in 1852 of a man so-called Yankee Jim Robinson, who was the last man to be hung at this site before the Whaley House was built. And we might note that Whaley was present during the execution and built this purchased the property later. By all accounts, he built this brick home where the gallows originally stood. If you've been on a ghost tour at the Whaley House, you will know that at least one of the spirits reputed to haunt this location is Yankee Jim. We might ask, however, why it is in a town, the majority of whose residents were native Californians, the ghost that haunts this place is named Yankee Jim. In this and so many other ways, the historical landscape around the Whaley House even today tends to write out the history of the people who were the majority of Old Town at the time the house was built. And that is, of course, native Californians and the Californio residents of Mexican-era Old Town. The Whaley House presents us a picture of San Diego's Old Town history as a Yankee town with a Yankee builder of a brick building, a Yankee court magistrate, and even a Yankee ghost. I'm going to pay careful attention as I go to see if there's any indication on the landscape that is provided here and curated here, even to today, that tells us more about who else lived in Old Town other than the Whaleys and people like them. You haven't failed to note the opportunities to go on a ghost tour here at the Whaley House, and probably some of you have been on a ghost tour at the Whaley House. But we might ask ourselves, why is it that this landscape is figured as one that is ripe for ghostly hauntings? It's not surprising in a place that is designed to sell a sense of history that some entrepreneurs have taken up the opportunity to sell tickets to introduce people to a spirit of the past. But certainly that connection to spirits of the past is something that the Whaley House attempts and other parts of the historic landscape here attempt to introduce us to. They attempt to give us a sense of connection to a spirit of the past, a sense of the past. And it's not but a short step from there to imagine that there might be closer connections, supernatural connections between the present and the past, which come together in the form of a ghost. After you've taken a close look at your historical landmark, you should take a look at the wider landscape surrounding it, just to see how it fits into a broader landscape of historical interpretation or historicity. You might note that here they've left some of the old bricks, old street bricks, in the pavement to give a sense of connection to the past. The wall around the Whaley House appears to be constructed in adobe brick, which would have been historic to the time period. It's a reconstruction, but nonetheless gives a sense of the historic place. We have hitching posts where you might hitch up your horse if you happen to come that way these days. We've got a gas light on the outside. We've got a boot scrape to get that horse shit off of the bottom of your shoe. Of course, the Whaley House is connected to historic Route 101, a 20th century highway, and other features, trash cans made out of barrels, another hitching post, more barrels on the porch, and someone with a good sense of humor who wrote in the concrete much more recently, Whaley, 1856. We can read all of these various features as an effort to tell us implicitly that we have entered a historical landscape. Whether that landscape is accurate to the time or not is less important, I think, in this case, than the sense that we have gone to a place that is old and is different than today. You should also look more widely at the landscape around your historical landmark to see what else is going on. Old Town San Diego has got a lot going on, and of course each of the different landowners and renters in these different commercial buildings may have their own different idea about San Diego's history, and so it can be a really exciting but also complicated place to try to read. But certainly we can see the effort to create a sense of sort of old Western shops, like the gift shop down the way. The Five and Dime has got its Spanish style red tile roof and some sort of historical bell across the top. We've got an Old Town saloon, and we've got lots and lots of Mexican food options. And so Old Town San Diego tells us not only that we've come to someplace that's old, as so many of these places say, but also is connected to San Diego's history as part of Mexico and the Californio era in San Diego, when Californios were the dominant political and social class. In this wider context, the Whaley House really stands out. Of course, it isn't the role of every historic building or museum to portray the whole history of any place or time, but we should be aware in looking at our California historical landmarks what choices of interpretation and presentation the owners or curators of these places are making. There are many ways to portray early American San Diego. Just down the street in the Old Town State Historical Park, the curators emphasize a sense of California in this period as a global melting pot, where people from all over the world came together to build a new society. We know from archaeological excavations done here at the Whaley House, in the backyard in the old privy, that the Whaley family themselves participated in this milieu. But the Whaley House in this interpretive landscape stands out not as a symbol for a global melting pot, but as an emblem of the new American generation, post-gold rush, the people who came to California not to blend into an existing society, but to build a new one on top of it. So I've got my pictures and my notes, and I'm going to go home and think about what I've seen here, but especially I'm going to compare the historical landscape and what it seems to be telling me about California in the 1850s and San Diego in the 1850s in comparison to what's on the landmarking plaque produced in the 1930s by the California Historical Landmarks Program. What's changed in that interpretation? What hasn't changed, and why? Those are important questions to ask as we think about the way that California's history is portrayed in public and what the crowds in places like Old Town are learning about California's history from landmarks like the Whaley House.